Hunter, question for you to start us off today. And you might not know this, but there's a very specific reason why I'm going to ask this question, which we're going to find out in a second. But that question is, do you know the postman's motto?
The postman's motto. I think I have a paraphrase of it, if it's what I'm thinking of. I think it goes something like through rain, through sleet, through snow, or something like that.
Very close. Yes. So first of all, point of clarity here. The U.S. Postal Service does not actually have an official motto. Okay. So what I'm about to say is sort of the unofficial motto that has been passed around from time to time. There's a whole history sort of behind it that we're not really going to get into because it's kind of an aside, but it's close to what you said. So the actual postman's motto is neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds.
Yeah, I was a little close, but yeah, I didn't quite have the whole thing.
I mean, you hit the overall theme of it. And the reason why I wanted to start out with this question, normally we start out with, I would say, maybe a more precise question for our episodes. Right. But I wanted to start with this question because it's highly geographic, right? It's talking about the actual physical elements as people move around to deliver mail to everybody's houses. And I thought that was really cool. And
that's interesting.
Oh, that ties really well into our episode today, which, as I'm sure everybody knows by now, but is all about the U.S. Postal Service.
I believe that was a motto that was slung around a little bit more often, in the 1900s, so to speak.
If you can believe it, Hunter, the actual phrase comes from, I have it right here, sitting here. This is coming from the USPS website. The phrase comes from Book 8, paragraph 98 of The Persian Wars by Herodotus, a Greek historian. So
I did not see that. I didn't see that coming. Yeah.
I don't think anybody would have anticipated Herodotus showing up in our episode on the U.S. Postal Service, but
here we are.
He gets around. All right, let's jump to today's episode. So let me get my notes back up here. Are we talking about the U.S. Postal Service today? So I would say there's a variety of reasons. We kind of hinted at this last week a little bit, but overall, I would say that there's an underlying geography that's sort of attached to the Postal Service that can't really be ignored, right? I think you would probably agree with that.
I totally agree. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, it's a service that, they go everywhere, right? They deliver mail to basically every single house, basically every single building that's ever been constructed, at least with an official address. Obviously, There's a lot of people who don't have official addresses, but still, like, they're going to a lot of places. There's a place, if you have a house that's sort of in the very far reaches, of northern Montana, you're likely still getting mail. So,
right. Like, unless they've got seaplanes and stuff in their fleet, I think, probably, or something, and they're bringing you your mail even if you live in a relatively remote location.
Yeah, and granted, you have to be connected to their network in some capacity, right? If you want to go out and you want to create sort of a completely off the grid shack in the middle of Alaska, and you don't ever tell the U.S. Postal Service that you're there, they're probably not going to find you.
Right. That's the time where you get a P.O. box, I think, at that point.
Exactly. Yeah. That said, if you do want them to deliver mail to you and you're within a relatively easy reach, now relatively easy for them can be pretty extreme, but you're not absolutely impossible to get to. They'll probably find a way to get mail to you. So it's very impressive, I would say, the lengths at which they go.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and it's a service, right? The government feels like there should be a government-sponsored service that allows people to communicate. And so that's why it exists,
a service.
Yeah.
Yep. It is a service. It is kind of run by the government. We're going to talk a little bit about that.
Okay.
It's a little bit different than what we're maybe normally used to with regards to our federal agencies. We are going to talk about some key facts and statistics a little bit with regards to the U.S. Postal Service, but that's a little bit later. We're not going to do too much of that. We're also going to talk a lot about sort of the geography that the U.S. Postal Service has created. What do you think I'm talking about here, Hunter?
I'm thinking the zip code is what you're probably referring to, right? Yeah.
We're going to talk so much about the zip code. In fact, by the end of this episode, listener, you're probably going to know far more about the zip code than you ever thought possible. to be honest, than you probably ever really wanted to know about the zip code. But this is a geography podcast, and that's sort of our bread and butter, right? They literally created their own geographic boundaries. They carved up the entire country into these geographic areas.
Absolutely right.
And there's a lot that goes into that, right? And there's a lot of other now people and agencies and everything else that sort of use those same sort of delineation, units that the post office created, not for any purpose other than their own thing. And that's a whole thing we're going to get into. Finally, we're not going to get into this too much in today's episode, not really at all aside from this, but I thought it was worth calling out that the U.S. Postal Service in recent years has become a bit of a political lightning rod, which I think just illustrates the importance of its role within the United States, right? As we live here in Oregon, we've had voting by mail for, well, I'm actually not sure when voting by mail in Oregon became a thing, but certainly decades.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah.
Since living here, so I moved here in 2010. Since living here, I've never not voted by mail, and it's wonderful. I love it. But I wanted to call that out as like, okay, there's a geography here around the elections too, and we're not going to really talk about that in today's episode. There's probably a future episode down the line where we're going to talk a little bit about election stuff. I'm not sure what that episode is going to look like. Maybe the U.S. Postal Service makes an appearance there, and we'll talk a little bit about that.
Maybe there's a little electoral college episode coming up or something like that.
Electoral college, a little voting by mail. We'll see. We'll see what makes it in and what doesn't. It's also worth pointing out that while we're talking about the U.S. Postal Service today, the United States Postal Service, it isn't the only postal service in the world. We are going to talk about some international postal services at the end of our episode today.
Good.
Today's episode is largely about the U.S. Postal Service because, one, we're here. Two, I think it makes for a really compelling story about how things came together. So all that's to say is if you're not here in the U.S., just know that your own postal service probably has a pretty interesting story and has probably done similar things to the U.S. Postal Service. In fact, I know, for example, with respect to the zip code, that places like the U.K. and Germany and Japan have their own versions of this.
That's right. Yep. I'm familiar with that phenomenon.
Oh, yeah. All right. So let's dive in. First question.
Yes.
Hunter, what is the U.S. Postal Service?
The U.S. Postal Service, the way I think about it, is some kind of government agency that's charged with mediating communication between individuals and companies within the country, and then also facilitating communication to other countries as well.
That's a great way to put it. In fact, I think that's one way that the actual purpose of the Postal Service and its original purpose kind of gets lost on people now, and that the Postal Service is, it's a communications organization, right?
Absolutely.
That's its. That's still what it is today, but I don't think we really think of it because now we have these, devices and things that allow communication instantly, and we more associate a company such as AT&T as a communications company, or even like an internet service provider, right? But U.S. Postal Service at its core is still a communications organization. They're delivering communication, letters and, packages. These are all different ways to communicate with people.
Yeah, it wasn't that long ago where that was the gig, right? That was the way that you could communicate. Right. Everybody got their bills that way. People corresponded that way. And as you're suggesting, I think for some people who are maybe younger today, the mail might not figure at all in their lives.
Probably not.
Yeah.
You get some Christmas cards, the sort of the end of the year, or a lot of people do, I guess.
Yeah.
That's for me, that's about the extent that things are, and the occasional postcard, which is very cool. Join a postcard club if you can. I think they're very fun. But I think it's important to sort of ground ourselves in sort of what the U.S. Postal Service is, because in so many ways, the U.S. Postal Service is actually fairly unique from other government agencies. And you hit on that. It feels like a government agency. It kind of is. But it's not a federal agency in the same way that, the Department of Transportation is, for example. Okay. So instead, it is something, it's classified as an quote unquote independent agency of the executive branch of the United States federal government. Okay. And this means it's responsible for providing and as being an independent agency, it's responsible for providing postal service in the US, its insular areas, and its associated states. So this would include the US territories of Guam, American Samoa, Northern Mariana Islands, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands, in addition to all 50 states.
And the District of Columbia.
and the District of Columbia. It also means that the U.S. Postal Service is bound to deliver mail to every U.S. military base around the world.
Okay.
So that does extend their footprint.
That opens it up a little bit more. Yeah.
Quite a bit. We're not going to talk a lot about how many U.S. military bases there are around the world. That could be a fascinating episode someday.
Agreed.
But just know, listener, that those things are scattered across the world. Mm-hmm. It's also one of the few government agencies that are explicitly authorized by the Constitution of the United States. So within the Constitution, this would be the document that sort of establishes everything about the United States.
The law of the land, right? Yeah.
The law of the land. So within the U.S. Constitution, there is a clause called the Postal Clause, and this explicitly grants Congress the power to establish post offices and postal roads. And so there's actually a lot of power in being a part of the official Constitution, because unlike, other branches, there's, sometimes that you hear sort of a rumor or a desire, to do away with, whatever branch of government.
Eliminate the Department of Education or something like that.
Eliminate the Department of Education. Under no way would Congress be able to simply eliminate the U.S. Postal Service
without a constitutional amendment. Yeah.
It's in the Constitution. It has to be there. But that doesn't mean that Congress hasn't changed the way in which the U.S. Postal Service operates. And so today, because it's that independent federal agency, the U.S. Postal Service is self-sustaining and is kind of required to be self-sustaining. This means that it has its own revenue forecast. It has profit and losses. It has these things that we more commonly associate with, I guess, just a normal company. Like I used AT&T earlier, but AT&T, right? This is a company that has to report, profits and losses, and if they don't make that money back, the Congress can bail them out, right? And that's happened in the past. But it's not the same as the U.S. Department of Transportation, right? The U.S. Department of Transportation isn't required to generate its own revenue.
Right. They can operate in the red in the way that the post office isn't supposed to. They have to be paying for their services, have to pay for itself. They can't operate at a loss.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, and they can operate at a loss, and they frequently do. But again, if they do operate at a loss, they have to go and make the case to Congress to basically close that gap.
Right.
The difference being, Department of Transportation or Interior or whatever, they're given a set budget of, let's say $500 million per year. I don't know what any of their budgets actually are, but let's say $500 million per year. That's what they're going to go out and spend. And then that's it. There's no profit and loss necessarily at any point involved in that situation.
Right.
Maybe for some minor parts of their projects, right? Maybe the US DOT has some sort of toll program and that has some profit and losses, but it's like overall, it's not part of the overall equation.
Okay. Yeah.
Big difference. Amtrak would be the only other independent government agency that operates in a similar manner.
And we've talked about Amtrak in past episodes.
Ooh. We've talked a lot about Amtrak.
That's
so
right.
Go check out any one of those very fun episodes.
High Speed Rail, I think, was one of them. There might have been a few others. Yeah.
They seem to wind their way into our episodes, but I'm a big train nerd, so that's probably normal.
I think that's
so. Let's talk a little bit about the history of the U.S. Postal Service, how it became an actual thing. So before the official establishment of a national postal service, mail in the United States was handled sporadically, often through kind of informal arrangements. So letters were typically carried by friends, merchants. Native Americans would often trade, different sort of letters and stuff after the, before any sort of formal, organizational structure. And these were often traveled or brought, either by foot or by horse.
Okay.
And so this would be sort of, 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. Native Americans had probably been doing this for a long time, well before any sort of documented proof of any sort of, but, that system probably existed, right? Because it's just communication. That's all it is.
Right.
But in 1775, during the Second Continental Congress, Benjamin Franklin was appointed the first Postmaster General. Did you know this is one of another feather in his many in his cap?
I knew he was involved in many things, but I didn't realize that being Postmaster General was one of his titles.
Yeah, clearly it was. I did not know this before I started pulling this episode together either. I was like, well, okay, there you go. There's another one. So Franklin would set the foundations of the Postal Service we know today, which included a more organized mail route system from Massachusetts down to Georgia, the establishment of more reliable schedules, and the creation of a standardized rate chart based on distance and item weight, right? So this is basically the stamp system, right?
Right.
How much does it cost to get one thing from here to there? It's going to depend on, well, where's it going and how much does it weigh? Always.
Right. That's right.
Now today, it can also be like, well, how fast do you want it to be there? Do you want it to be tracked? And
right. You get some more options. Do you want to insure your message or your package or whatever? Yeah.
Yeah, you get a little add-ons here and there. Following the American Revolution, the Postal Service became enshrined in the Constitution, which we already talked about, which empowered Congress to establish post offices and postal roads. I believe the U.S. Postal Service is in addition to U.S. DOT and some Department of Interior agencies, is one of the only federal agencies that's permitted to construct and maintain its own road system. So, postal roads.
Postal roads.
Right. This would be similar to forest roads, which the U.S. Forestry Service manages. Right. And then, of course, U.S. DOT handles, the things that most of us travel on, which would be the interstates.
Right.
The acknowledgement of this in the Constitution underscored the importance of mail as a vital tool for communication that was essential to the establishment of a brand new country, right? Mm-hmm. So somebody, maybe it was Benjamin Franklin, I'm not exactly sure who came up with the idea, but somebody at some point was like, if we're going to be our own country, we need to have communication tools that are organized and we can sort of communicate effectively because, well, I think they already knew that they were going to be a really big country. Like the 13 colonies were already quite large, right?
Right. So we need a system of communication. We need to be able to disseminate information. And then that also sort of reifies the fact that this is a functioning state, a functioning government.
Exactly. Which is always very important, especially for a new country, right? It's you want to establish that you are legitimate, you're able to do things that everybody else can, all that kind of stuff. So in 1792, the Postal Service Act formally created the Post Office Department. This act also included provisions that safeguarded the privacy of personal correspondences and allowed newspapers to be mailed at very low rates, supporting the spread of information across the vast distances of the, at the time, the young country, right? And so again, this sort of ties into some other core fundamental aspects of the United States, especially in that early years, so like, freedom of press, freedom of speech, sort of like ties all into that these things also come with stipulations that the federal government should be enabling the dispersion of these materials, right?
Right. For the functioning,
so
it helps the country function is probably what they're thinking.
Exactly.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So throughout the 19th century, this would be the 1800s, the post office innovated further in response to growing and increasingly mobile population. So the introduction of the steamboat and railroad for mail transportation vastly improved the speed and reliability of mail service. That's probably not a surprise. Basically, the rail changed a lot of things during this period of time. And then there was the Pony Express. Have you ever heard of the Pony Express?
I have heard of the Pony Express. I'm not sure I know any actual details other than that there's somebody on a horse who is bringing mail places.
I mean, I don't have too much here.
I'm probably missing some important information there, but
I don't have too much here on the Pony Express. But just know that it was relatively short lived, but it did become sort of a legendary symbol of the rugged sort of Western areas of the country that were very vast, and the only way that people could get mail, because there wasn't trains crisscrossing the area and there weren't roads at this point in time either, was that a series of stations were set up where a rider would get mail, deliver it to the next station, and then sort of relay race it to whatever its final destination was. And this is how sort of all these little like, I don't know what you would call them now, there's like saloon towns from like the Old West would get mail.
Yeah, these towns that sort of linked different places together, and I'm guessing this wasn't a daily mail service. Probably, like if you were,
I would not guess that. I didn't check that, but that would be pretty impressive. So the Pony Express though was relatively short lived, as I already mentioned, because it existed basically for a short period of time up until the transcontinental telegraph system was in place, which it just didn't have that much time, and then it was kind of already obsolete. So I think its legacy has endured far longer than it itself, obviously.
Yeah, for sure. And so the telegraph situation, that was separate from, those are companies operating separate from the Postal Service?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's already competition for the Postal Service.
It's competition, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the U.S. Postal Service, I couldn't find anything in the history, but maybe somebody knows, but I couldn't find them ever sort of being interested in sort of what we'd say today is with telecommunications, right? Sort of telephone lines, internet, telegraphs, that kind of stuff. I never really saw any mention of them being involved. That's not to say they weren't. It just didn't really hit sort of what I was trying to get at. The Post Office Department transformed into the United States Postal Service, the U.S., in 1971, a change that marked a transition from a cabinet department to a self-sustaining independent federal agency. So again, we talked about this earlier, that they need to be self-sustaining. They have profit and loss. This happened in 1971, so not that long ago. We're
not that long ago. Yeah.
Compared to how old it is, right? It's 200 plus years. It's only been a self-sustaining independent agency for 40 or 50.
53. Yeah.
53. Yeah, there we go. The reorganization was part of a broader effort to make the service more efficient and financially viable. And I think at that point, it was sort of looked at as maybe not a financially viable agency where it could self-sustain itself, but also bring money into the United States government as a whole. Because again, 1971, it's a very different time. There's still a lot of mail going around, and there's a lot of money to be made doing that.
Facilitating commerce is really one of the big things here, not just general communication, but for businesses to operate.
Absolutely. So this would come with some key innovations. The big one being the zip code, which we're going to talk all about in a little bit. So we're going to hold on to that for a second. But today, the U.S. Postal Service operates I would argue, one of the most impressive logistical and delivery networks in the entire world. And that's not to say that other postal services aren't also very impressive. They are, but this is also still very impressive. And so, it does maintain that its mission to provide postal services to every American citizen, U.S. citizen, irrespective of geography, at a uniform price and quality. And so, again, unless you want to be disconnected from the U.S. Postal Service, you can get your mail delivered to you. And perhaps most importantly, if you're that person in the middle of Alaska or northern Montana, very far away, it's still going to be the same price as if you were in the heart of New York or Los Angeles.
Right, for a letter or something. For packages, maybe that changes a little bit. But yeah, there's a stamp that you use, and you can use it wherever within the system, and that's the flat price, which increases once in a while, but it increases for everybody.
Yep. So according to the USPS's own statistics in 2022, the agency generated nearly $79 billion in revenue, but it was not profitable.
I see.
It fell about $6 billion short from profitability. So not super great for an agency that's supposed to be self-sustaining, but it is what it is.
Yes.
It had about 517,000 employees, again, as of 2022. I'm not sure how that's changed since then. And in 2022, it carried 127.3 billion pieces of mail. And so I mathed this out a little bit, but that's about 246,000 pieces of mail for each employee that the U.S. Postal Service has, which is that's phenomenal. I mean, it makes sense, right? Each day they're probably carrying thousands of things around their network, but it's incredible.
I can't help but think what percentage of this is what we sometimes call junk mail.
Oh, today I'm going to guess a lot, a high percentage, very high. So with that, let's go ahead and jump to our very first ad break. We're going to talk all about the zip code when we come back. So it should be very fun. And for people who are like, I don't really need to know about the zip code, believe me, it's quite interesting.
You got to find out about this. Sort of what it means. You'll be happy you stuck around.
Yeah. All right. We will be right back. And we're back. We are talking about the geography of the US Postal Service today. We just ran through a bunch of history and sort of the beginnings of the US Postal Service. Now we're going to launch into a riveting discussion on the zip code, which is going to be really fun, I promise. So, and by the way, I don't know how many people know this, but ZIP, ZIP, actually stands for Zone Improvement Plan.
I did not know that. That's news to me. Yeah.
I didn't know it either. I always knew it had to stand for something because it was all in capital letters, but I never really thought too much about it. I think in a lot of countries, it's just called postal code or something, similar to that, and obviously varying different languages. But for here, it's the zip code. So, but yeah, anyways, that's what it's called. So let's talk about the zip code and what it even is. Hunter, first question, what can you tell us about the zip code?
All right. So my understanding of the zip code is that it is a designation, a geographic designation that allows the U.S. Post Office to figure out how to sort through all these billions of pieces of mail that we talked about before. So there's a geographic distinction that is how they organize everything and how they keep the system running.
That's a really good guess. And we're going to talk about what it actually is. Before we do that, though, I do think it's important to note that the zip code, despite its many uses today outside of postal delivery, which we're going to get to in a little bit as well, is nothing more than a series of convenient routes and points for any given delivery path. And I think that's an important distinction because even though what you just said is mostly true, Hunter, and we've even said, sort of in this episode, how it's sort of a geographic boundary. It's sort of an area that would be, sort of synonymous with a polygon on a map.
Right.
It's really not.
It's more of a route, huh?
It's a route. It's a route with point locations, which is, listener, as you're listening to this is probably a little hard to understand or even hard to understand why this might be important at all. But it is important because a lot of times, boundaries or geographic locations, area locations are carved up based on what's happening on the ground to some extent. And when you're doing it based on just a route, you're not thinking about sort of the space and place in the same way. And so that's
a map that we would see of postal codes suggests something different a little bit, right? Because it suggests that there's the polygon type situation that you talked about. I guess it would be pretty difficult to represent all these various routes on a map of the United States. That would get really squirrely, squiggly.
It would be impossible.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to think about, that it's more of a route, although that's not the way it's usually represented.
Absolutely, yes. So, and I think the key thing to take away here is that the zip codes are not based on any statistically meaningful underlying data.
Okay.
Hold on to that thought because that's going to be an important caveat as we talk about, especially what some of the other uses for the zip code are.
Okay.
Now, Hunter, if you were to take a wild guess, I don't expect you to know this, but if you were to take a wild guess, about how many zip codes would you say are in existence today?
Oh, I should have prepped for this, knowing that we were doing this episode. How many zip codes are there in the United States?
Honestly, I don't even know how I would answer this question. I would be like, I don't know, a bajillion?
Right, yeah. 40,000.
Wow, no way. That is a really good answer or really good guess because there's actually 41,704 zip codes today.
That's
which is
a pretty good guess.
That was a really good guess. I don't know how you honed in on that, whether it was just a wild sort of,
I was thinking approximately 50 states, even though I know there's other territories, and that maybe on average it was close to 1,000, but probably a little bit less. So that was my thinking.
Great guess. So
I need to go on a game show with this kind of talent. Yeah.
I think, that's definitely a good, what's the Price is Right rule? It's like closest without going over,
right?
Kind of thing. I think you would have won that one.
Right. Yeah.
So now that we have that out of the way, let's go over how we got to the zip code in the first place. And I want to highlight that much of the information that I have here is coming from a very convenient for me white paper from the U.S. Postal Service itself called The Untold Story of the Zip Code. And so I don't know if I could have found a better source for this.
I would like to get a hold of this document myself, I think.
It is quite dry, I assure you, but it was very good for me to pull out information,
So
sort
give
of
us
the
the
history.
highlights, right? Is that what's about to happen here?
Exactly. So at present, and according to this white paper, which is dated back to 13, by the way, so it's a little old. It's about 10 years old at this point. The Postal Service delivers 40% of the world's mail to 5% of the world's population. And so it's a task that's really, daunting just
80%
because
of
of
the
the
world's mail.
40% of the world's mail. Again, this
That's
is coming
amazing.
from their own white paper. I'm not
Yeah,
sure where their stats are
right.
coming from. But I mean, maybe we have more junk mail here. I don't know. I
Yeah,
don't know.
interesting.
But if we think about it, this task is made very daunting by the geographic size of the United States. Now, obviously, there are other places that are really huge in size as well: Brazil, Russia, China,
Right.
Canada, just to the north of us. Right? These are
That's
all
right.
very vast places. So this is not to diminish any of those postal services,
I think
but it
you
is
just
just to
named
highlight.
the 4 largest countries in the world, I think, pretty
Yeah,
much, of which the United
yeah,
States comes in 3 after Russia and Canada, and I think Brazil is next. So, yeah, we're
yep,
up there.
that is true. So the U.S. Postal Service, their original sorting methods depended solely on local addresses and hand sorting, right? So mail would come in, you would have a
Wow.
mail carrier. It's like,
Yep.
okay, this is going to New York. Obviously, we're going to send it over there, and then the local carriers would have to discern where that is, right, based on their own knowledge of the area. So it's very sort of local knowledge oriented.
Mhm.
And before the advent of the zip code and automated sorting, of course, the average mailed letter was handled by anywhere from 8 to 10 postal employees. So
Wow.
you send it out from your place, here in Portland, and it's going to New York. At some point, that's somebody is looking at that and trying to discern where it's going.
Right.
But eight or 10 people are
So
trying
8
to
or
do
10
that.
people have to get and be engaged in that process of figuring out where
Yep.
this letter is going.
Exactly. Yeah. This manual sorting became even more laborious as customers' use of mail grew by almost 160% between 1940 and 1965. So a lot more mail sort of spiking during that period. Probably coincides with the overall wealth increase of the country. Of course, that's not felt by everybody equally,
That's right.
but generally there's an overall wealth increase, which means people are probably moving to farther locations. So families moving farther apart, more mails crisscrossing the country, all that kind of stuff.
Well, there's a
Now,
housing boom, right? Like, that goes along with
there's a
the
housing
baby
boom,
boom,
right?
right? Yeah.
Yep,
Yep.
baby boom, yeah, everything. And so this is about the time. So between 1940 and 1965, this is sort of the time when the U.S. Postal Service is starting to conceive of this idea of the zip code. Okay, we need to organize our country in a way that just makes more sense because we can't keep doing this. There's too much mail going around the country. It's getting sort of unwieldy. And so they start thinking about this idea. Let's maybe create a zip code or the precursors to that. And apparently, executives at AT&T, which I think is different from the AT&T that exists today, or maybe it's the same. I don't know. It's
There've
gone
been
through
some
some breakups
mergers.
and
Yeah, yeah.
mergers. But apparently, executives at AT&T, which was a corporation at the time, warned the U.S. Postal Service that they had a lot of difficulty getting people to use area codes for telephone numbers, and that the public might likewise be hesitant to adopt the zip code.
Interesting. So the AT&T is American Telegraph and maybe Telegram. We should probably fact check that, but I think they're involved in sending this. This is the rival, really, in a lot of ways, to the
Right.
U.S. Post Office.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a rival. It's because they're all inside the communications game, but I think they're also like, hey, maybe like we just had to do this, get everybody to adopt an area code for the telephone service,
And they're not
maybe,
loving
and
it.
it didn't work out super
Yeah.
well for us. It's very hard to get people to adopt it. Well, it's hard to get people to adopt really anything that's not really their choice. And so I think they're just saying like, hey, like, we know this is a thing that you're trying to do, and it might not be the best idea because it's yet another number.
It is the American
However,
Telephone
the
and
US
Telegraph Company. Sorry to interrupt, but the American Telephone and
telephone and
Telegraph
telephone.
Company. So I was not correct, but close, which just seems to be the theme here.
This is sort of an aside, but I think AT&T would make a fascinating episode one day because that was the company that I think got too big and then got broken up into all what they called the baby bells.
Right. Yeah. No, we should definitely revisit this.
Yeah. So, anyways, well, maybe someday.
So,
anyways, the U.S. Postal Service actually wasn't that worried because they had looked at a study of the West German postal code rollout in the early 1960s. The zip code, of course, came out in sort of the mid 1960s, and it found that the country achieved an 80% public adoption rate within its first year of use. Now, this came with a very organized plan by the West German Postal Service, right? They had an extensive promotion campaign. They did a lot of work beforehand, and this is something that the U.S. Postal Service is going to adopt as well.
Okay.
And so, have you ever heard of a character called Mr. Zip?
I think I know who you're talking about, because I remember, and this would have been from when I was a kid, there's this cartoonish character who's kind of leaning in one direction because he's moving very quickly with a satchel of mail on his side. He's got sort of really big eyes, smiling. Is that Mr. Zip?
That is 100% Mr. Zip.
Okay, all right. I do know.
So the U.S. Postal Service, they did a lot of work, right? They created a whole little cartoon about it. They sent out these mailers. In fact, you can see some of these mailers maybe on Wikipedia. I can't remember where I saw them. Actually, it might have been inside this untold story of the zip code. But they sent out these mailers that sort of had like very fun graphics attached to them saying, hey, here's a new thing. It's going to help organize things. This is sort of part of your place, all this kind of stuff. And so that work paid off tremendously well. So the zip code was rolled out officially in 1963. Apparently by 1969, which is just 6 years later, about 90% of the public supported the use of the zip code, and about 83% were actively using it. Now, that's not quite as quick as West Germany,
right?
But still pretty fast.
Solid.
Given the size of the U.S.
So
right?
Mr. Zip was from the 60s then. Is that what we're talking about?
Mr. Zip was rolled out probably maybe
in the 50s?
The process probably started well beforehand, but I'm not sure. I actually don't have data on when the marketing campaigns rolled out.
I'm just
but
trying
my
to
guess
think
would
of
be
the aesthetic of the character and match it up against my understanding of the aesthetics of various decades. But yeah, 50s, 60s, clearly.
It is interesting. I'm looking at Mr. Zip right now, and it's a cute little cartoon. It's very rudimentary. It's almost like, this is not what I would say is like Disney quality.
Oh yeah,
Disney was a thing.
Definitely more basic than I remember now that I'm looking at it as well.
Yeah, I don't know. They probably didn't have a big budget. I don't know. And cartooning was just a much more, rudimentary sort of art form at the time. So
I suppose, yeah. But Snow White came out in the 30s, and that blows this away for sure. No offense to the Zip family, but anyways.
Yeah, you're doing Mr. Zip pretty dirty right now. And so I already mentioned this. USPS would officially begin the rollout of the zip code in 1963, and it was based on an earlier system of postal codes used in large cities and expanded it to a 5-digit system. So if you're looking at your zip code right now, so let's take, my zip code here is 97231 or something like that. I should actually know that. Yeah. 231. This is how little I have to send mail, right? But anyway, so those first 3 numbers correspond with the sectional center of whatever it is.
Okay.
And this usually aligns with states, although sometimes states can have multiples.
Okay.
And then those last 2 numbers are the local area. And those last 2 numbers are what these originally spawned from, and they were typically only associated with larger cities. And so you would, if you find an old piece of mail from the early part of the 1900s, it'll say, let's say it's coming from Minneapolis, and it's like Minneapolis, here's the address, Minneapolis, comma, and then there's 2 numbers, 11, comma,
I see,
USA or something like that.
So they kept those 2 numbers, and then they put the regional numbers in front of them.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's how they sort of formed the basis of the zip code as we know it today. In 1983, the Postal Service, which replaced the Post Office Department, expanded the number of digits in the zip code to 9. And this is what we commonly refer to as zip plus 4.
Right.
Have you ever heard that phrase before, zip plus 4?
I'm not sure I've heard plus 4, but I know about the 9 numbers because I see it on my mail once in a while. I'm like, oh, wow, I guess this is my actual zip code. It's a little bit longer than I thought.
Well, it's going to get a little bit more complicated. I'm guessing you do not know what your +4 is.
I do, only because right
Oh,
before
really?
we started recording this, I looked at a piece of mail because I thought that question might come up.
I can't even get my own zip code right, and you know your +4. It's a wildly different
thing, Jeff. I think that's happening right now, maybe.
Apparently, Hunter, these additional digits identify a side of a street or an office building, for example.
Okay.
So that's sort of what they're for. So north side, south side, east side, west side.
Interesting.
That's sort of how it's determined.
Very geographical.
If you can believe it, and we don't know about this, but there's actually an 11-digit code that the U.S. Postal Service uses today.
I believe it. Yeah.
I'm not going to talk about that because I have no idea. I didn't want to dig into it. It's a little beyond sort of what I was trying to get at. But I thought it was very interesting that they've moved on beyond zip +4. Now maybe they're at zip +4+2 or zip +6. I don't know. So that's broadly the history of the zip code. And I think right now we're going to jump into sort of talking about the prominence of the zip code under, sort of the geography of it, inside the United States. But before we do that, we have to jump to our last ad break.
Okay. Well, in that case, we'll be right back.
And we're back. We are talking about the U.S. Postal Service today. We just ran through a lot of the history of the zip code. Now we're going to talk about some of the other uses of the zip code that sort of fall outside of the U.S. Postal Service. Because while it's created by the U.S. Postal Service for their mail routes and delivering mail to various places, it's actually been adopted by a lot of different organizations for, a lot of different things. So we're going to talk about that. So question for you, Hunter, right off the bat. Outside of mail, how do you think the zip code might be used?
There's one thing that comes to mind immediately, and that's for marketing. I'm guessing that it's used in marketing because there's demographics attached to it, and that this is a shorthand way of target marketing, probably.
It's absolutely used for targeted marketing. I mean, I think at its very base, right? If we go back to sort of the middle part of the 1900s when there wasn't internet or anything like that, the marketing that was done, especially direct to consumer marketing, was done through mail, and we still feel that today, right? You get junk mail, you get flyers sent to you, you get I don't know about you, Hunter, but I typically every other week I get like a whole little flabby newspaper thing with a bunch of coupons or something.
Yeah,
I don't really look at it.
I get that document as well, whatever it is.
But there's that I would say is probably one of the more, I don't know, not benevolent uses of the zip code, but certainly benign uses of the zip code.
Okay.
But there's some I would say that are more malevolent. And so if I said the word, or the words, I should say, insurance premiums to you.
Okay. Yeah.
How do you think that might wrap up into the zip code?
Well, I'm just going to go off of what you've suggested here, and that insurance companies are using zip codes to maybe their idea of the risk involved in insuring particular areas, and then there's going 100%. To be fixed prices accordingly.
100%. So if you're shopping for car insurance, for example, and you go onto, I don't know, a car insurance company's website, is inevitably going to ask you what your zip code is. And you're going to have provided a lot of information. And through a lot of that information, it's going to give you some number that makes sense to them. I don't know how. I think there's a whole science behind it called actuarial science, maybe. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. That's out of my realm.
There's a whole science around this risk that goes into it. But the zip code is a key one. And that's how insurance companies are determining whether the geography that you live in is less risky or more risky. Right. And that comes with a whole host of issues, in my opinion. There are other aspects here too. So for example, a lot of federal agencies use the zip code. So the IRS, FBI use it. The census actually uses it, although the census uses zip codes to tabulate some of their data. They don't like to do it.
Right.
They actually have their own geography called census tracts
and everything, some other divisions. Yeah.
Yeah, but they do use the zip code because it's become so popular elsewhere outside of the Postal Service. So they feel like they kind of have to divvy up their data a little bit there. Public utility companies use it, phone, gas, electricity. There's a lot that goes into the zip code outside of carrying mail. And I think the issue, again, if we go back to sort of the beginning of this episode when we were talking about these zip codes weren't divvied up based on any sort of statistically meaningful data underneath. It was the convenience and most efficient pathway of any given route for the delivery of mail. And so it becomes, I would argue, problematic to use the zip code for almost anything else. To me, it's kind of astounding. Aside from maybe like, obviously mailing stuff, marketing stuff to you, that kind of makes sense to me. But everything outside of that's like, well, I don't know if this really holds up.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think that perhaps, and I don't know this, but that the zip code was used in redlining, perhaps. Like that might be one.
I don't know, actually. I think redlining came pretty early in the 1900s, and the zip code wasn't until well after that.
Oh, that's a good point.
But that's not to say they weren't used in conjunction with each other at some point in similar manners. Yeah. In fact,
not trying to malign the zip code for being involved in redlining, but it seems to me that that's possible.
Well, what I was going to say was that the redlining was often, I mean, there was official capacities for it, but it was often done through insurance, right?
Right.
That was sort of the, insurance companies saying like, this is not a good place to invest versus this is a good place to invest. And they did that often based on racial divides. Right.
They took some demographics and banks were involved in this. And yes, I don't know how the zip code figures in that, but
I think looking forward, now we have insurance companies that are basically using the zip code to do kind of similar things.
Right.
I don't necessarily know if we can say it's based on racial divides, but there's probably some of that going on, I would argue. I mean, there has to be, right? In fact, we're going to talk a little bit about this starting right now, but it's sort of the cultural attachment of zip codes, because people have glommed onto zip codes as being a good zip code or a bad zip code. And that comes with a lot of, I would say, negative trends in society, I guess what I'll say about that. Okay. So, Hunter, question for you.
Yes.
What, in your opinion, or not an opinion, what's the first zip code outside of your own that you can rattle off?
You mean outside of the one that I currently live in?
Yeah, just a zip code that is prominent in your headspace.
Oh, 06457.
Oh, interesting. What's that one?
That's where I grew up.
Oh, interesting. That's a really good answer. In fact, I should have made that a caveat that you can't have lived anywhere. But the zip code I was looking for was, and you're going to know this right off the top of the bat.
90210.
Right off the top of the bat. 90210. Yes.
I think this has even come up in previous episodes.
It did. Yeah. So I wanted to bring that up because it highlights a very important cultural touchstone for the zip code. Now, I am pulling a lot of my information in this next section from an article out of the New Republic titled "The Tyranny of the Zip Code" by Anna Clark. And Anna Clark sort of went through and highlighted a bunch of different, cultural aspects of the zip code, sort of what people are associating them with. And so according to that article, zip codes carry a lot of cash, so to say, for the exclusivity of rich communities.
Right.
And so business journals in Portland, South Florida, Phoenix, and North Carolina are among those that rank the wealthiest zip codes within their respective areas, states. So this spotlighting residential areas with the highest average net worth. Do you know what that zip code might be here in, or what place that might be attached to here in Oregon?
The richest zip code in Oregon? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. Do you know where that might be here?
It's in Lake Oswego or Southwest Hills.
Absolutely.
Is it? Yeah.
Lake Oswego. Right. Yep.
Nailed it. Okay.
So, I mean, but we can see how that might be problematic, right? Because now you're associating wealth and sort of good with a specific zip code, which again, is not what zip codes were ever supposed to be for. This is not how they were supposed to work. We're attaching these sorts of ideas to a thing that's not even really a polygon or a boundary. It's just a route with houses on that route or buildings.
But it's become so much more. I mean, as you're describing.
So much more. In pop culture, zip codes serve as instantly recognizable cultural shorthand. So we already talked about Beverly Hills 90210, which is a real zip code. And of course, there's the reality show Brooklyn 11223. I'm not super familiar with that reality show, but apparently it exists, or maybe it did exist. Melissa and Joe Gorga on The Real Housewives of New Jersey recently declared their intention to, quote, move to a better zip code.
I see.
Recently, I guess this is now 10 years ago, but this is inside the article.
Right.
There's even the fictional zip codes, right? Those exist too, right? They're created to, for fictional places. So there's this example they pulled up inside the article of the TV show Veronica Mars.
Okay.
Which I believe was maybe in like the mid 2000s. I didn't really watch it, but they described the rich people within the show as 09ers, and that is from the 90909 zip code. It's worth highlighting that there's no 90909 zip code.
No such zip code.
No such zip code. But they wanted to have that as sort of a part of that show, that fictionalized show, to illustrate that people are using zip codes as a defining feature of maybe even your value to a place, right? You're from this zip code. You are of wealth.
I think I remember an episode of SNL where one of the Beverly Hills 90210 characters was on like as the host, and they had this thing where they were changing the zip code, and everybody got super bent out of shape. And then they got their zip code back or something. I think Chris Farley was the postal employee who said, "You got your zip code back."
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that example, even though that was probably in jest because it was on, you said Saturday Night Live, right?
Yeah.
So probably in jest, but apparently residents of Hyde Park, Massachusetts, this is back in 2013, won their battle to have the U.S. Postal Service change their zip code. So they had a zip code that U.S. Postal Service was going to change it because they were wary of high insurance rates and low property values they faced, because they then would share a zip code with neighboring Mattapan, where poverty and crime were higher, apparently. And so they were part of this community. They were going to have their zip code. Maybe there was going to be a whole new zip code created. It was going to be formed out of these two things. Again, the U.S. Postal Service isn't doing this with any sort of data underneath. They're just creating it based on their routes and how they're going to deliver mail in an efficient manner. The residents of this Hyde Park town sued and were able to keep their old zip code. Very fascinating.
That's right. Fiction imitating life, or life imitating fiction. One of those. I don't know which came first, but I mean, this is amazing, but not entirely surprising.
It's not surprising at all, I would say. Staples, the office retailer, was among businesses, again, back in 2013, exposed for offering better deals to customers with affluent zip codes. So if you lived in an affluent zip code, you were given better deals based on maybe mailers, or maybe I know retailers often collect zip codes. Maybe there's something in there.
It should be the reverse anyways, first of all. But yeah, that's nefarious.
Yeah. Apparently 5 Brooklyn politicians sued because Hurricane Sandy, back in the early 2010s, Hurricane Sandy food stamps were only allotted to 12 zip codes. Again, this is a way that the government was sort of allotting benefits. Again, using the zip code, which there's no data attached to it. So you can start to see the theme here, right? This is very problematic to use the zip codes, yet it's so culturally and organizationally prominent in both public and private sort of sectors.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It makes me think of, the prefix that we use that you mentioned before for the phone, right? The 3 numbers,
right?
The area code. And how that probably follows suit in a lot of ways. And I remember at one point, they had to break up some of the area codes. Like Connecticut had one, and they decided they needed another one. So it was the richer areas got to keep the old area code. So it's kind of tracks that way as well.
Yeah. We could go on and on. There's probably a lot of examples of zip code being used in different ways that is probably not, good. I would just argue, as we leave this sort of section, that zip codes have enormous cultural attachment today. People really love their zip codes. Not everybody's like me where they can't rattle off their zip code offhand. But I would argue that people kind of relate to it in kind of similar ways as they might do with their city, their neighborhood, and, as you already suggested, Hunter, their area code.
Well, this is all place identity stuff, right? Which is stuff that we both study and talk a lot about, and that one of the ways in which people make sense of themselves as belonging to a group or not belonging to a group or connected to a certain place. And there's lots of different things involved in that, but the zip code is not incidental. It actually matters to some people. It is
Absolutely.
a way of it's an identity marker in some ways.
Absolutely. And so, Hunter, I wanted to end today with, talking about some of the international postal services.
Oh, good.
We're running a little long on time, so we're going to probably breeze through this pretty quickly.
Okay.
But I want to talk a little bit about it. So according to the Universal Postal Union, which is an agency of the United Nations, there are currently 172 national postal services in the world. Of course, there's probably more, and there are variations of postal services that aren't quite national, but they exist sub-regional. And I don't think these are actually counted under this thing, but just know that these are sort of the ones that they're counting as part of the United Nations.
But not exactly the same number of countries that are recognized by the United Nations. I think the United Nations is up to in the neighborhood of 193 or something like that.
I believe you are correct. Around 193. So this would be that minus 20. So I don't know exactly who's missing. I didn't figure out the data.
Yep.
But this organization produces a report every few years that ranks every postal service based on what they have is their 4 pillars of postal development. And so these are categorized by reliability, which reflects performance in terms of speed and predictability of delivery. Their reach, so this is the global connectivity by evaluating the breadth and depth of the postal operator's international networks measured by the number of partner networks across all key segments of their physical postal services. Their relevance, this measures the intensity of demand for the full portfolio of postal services. And their resilience, and this is the level of diversification of revenue streams, as well as the capacity to innovate and deliver inclusive postal services. So reliability, reach, relevance, and resilience, that's sort of their 4 pillars there. Now, taking that into account, not that you would necessarily know this off the top of your head, but sure, why not? Do you want to take a stab at which country has the best postal service in the world?
Well, I got a 1 in 172 shot, I think, of getting this right. Do you have like a top 10 list so I can see if I'm on the list or anything? How many choices do I get? How many guesses do I get?
You can rattle off a few guesses.
All right, Switzerland just comes to my mind as a possibility. Is that on that list?
That's your top guess?
I'm going to go with Switzerland.
That's a really good guess because that is 100% right.
Really?
Now, the caveat here being is not. So
I should go play the lottery today, I feel like, after this episode.
It's ranked on a 100-point scale, and Switzerland got 100 out of 100.
That's pretty good.
For them.
Yeah.
Now, the Universal Postal Union is based in Switzerland.
I see. Wow.
So
that's also not surprising. Yeah.
I don't want to say that there's bias involved, but there might be a little bias.
Full disclosure, right? Yeah. Okay.
So you didn't need all of your guesses, I guess. Would you want to take a guess at where the U.S. Postal Service lands broadly?
From 1 to 172? I'm going to say 25.
Ooh, you do not have a high opinion of our U.S. Postal Service.
I just figured that. I mean, that's still pretty good out of 172.
That's still pretty good. The U.S. Postal Service is ranked 6th.
That's pretty solid. Yeah.
Yeah, so this would be behind Austria.
I probably won't be getting my mail for a while after that response, I think.
This is behind Austria, Germany, Japan, and France. But above, this is the top 10, above the United Kingdom, Netherlands, Canada, and China. And China, in fact, this is the first time that they've made the top 10. Well, they might have been top 10 for at least a few years. But in the report I was reading, they had basically said like how much China's postal service had modernized in recent years and how much it had jumped. It jumped. Right now it's sitting at 79.7 points out of 100. Okay. Apparently just a few years back, it was like hovering around the 50s. So
which country is that? Say it again.
This is China.
China. Right. Yeah. I could see that being pretty high on the list. Japan and Germany were going to be my other guesses. So they're on there. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's basically it. We're not going to dive into sort of all the different postal services. They all probably have a very similar story. You know, we touched on sort of the West German postal code rollout that they did. And I imagine that I imagine every country has some version of their own zip code, and there's probably some cultural attachments on some level. I don't know if it's as big as the United States, but I would imagine there's probably some. It's just so hard to, I think, break away. Once you get any sort of thing that gets attached to your place, I think it's hard to like break that away from sort of the.
No, I think that's the point we were making before. It's absolutely relevant to the way that people see themselves, I think, in a lot of ways.
Totally.
I remember I'd lived in Belgium for a year, and this was like before the internet, or maybe it wasn't before the internet, before we had access to the internet. And so I was writing a lot of letters and getting letters from friends and family, and they didn't have mail service on Saturdays. So we were down to the 5 days. And so I was always hoping Friday would be a big mail day so I could open my letters, like paste them out throughout the weekend.
Yeah, that's funny. All right. Well, with that, Hunter, where can people find you?
I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I am co-author of a couple books with David Banas, and those are Portlandness, a cultural atlas, and Upper Left Cities, a cultural atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. And of course, I'm co-host of this podcast, Geography is Everything. Yeah,
thanks, Hunter. My name is Jeff Gibson. You can find me, in addition to this podcast, Geography is Everything, over on YouTube. You can just Google Jeff Geography, and I'm sure you're going to find it. If you enjoyed sort of what you listened to, and you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever, please rate and review us. It really helps us out. I really appreciate seeing those, reading those as they come in. Sometimes I wish I could reply to them because some of you are pretty witty on those comments. I'm like, oh, I see that. But there's just no way for me to respond to you on them. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. We really appreciate having you guys there and being able to talk with you sort of in person.
And maybe give a shout out to everybody in your zip code while you're doing that. Why not?
Give a shout out to your, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Where are you coming from? Right. That should be really fun to see. If you want this delivered straight to your email box, we do have a Substack newsletter. It's geographyiseverything.substack.com. It's totally free. Just go sign up with your email and you'll get it once a week, and sort of an easy way to get this. Of course, I think if you're subscribed on Apple Podcasts, it's the same thing. So whatever. It's just another way you can get access to this. Now, next week, Hunter, I think we have a really fun topic. What are we doing?
Oh, yeah, this is my topic, right? Yeah. So, all right. I believe the topic we're approaching next week is the Nile River.
It is the Nile River, which...
Big river, big topic.
Big river, big topic. It has enabled it's enabled ancient civilizations for thousands of years, right? In a place that, well, without it, it would be not... I mean, it'd be so different. It just probably would not have had.
It's essential to life and the parts of the world, the parts of Africa that it runs through. And so we'll get into that.
We're going to get into that. We're going to talk all about the Nile River, sort of what it's, I'm assuming the history, but also sort of what's going on with it today. Should be a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to it. Going back to one of our place-based episodes, which are always just fun to sort of talk about a specific area of the planet. Right. So come back next week where we are going to do a whole episode about the Nile River. And I guess until then, we will see you next time.
Thank you for listening.